Always an important.
Greetings and welcome to the Fordham Institute this afternoon. Both those that have joined us in person on a lovely end of July day and those that are watching around the planet, which is a large number, and all are invited, if they are so motivated, to tweet in at #LackingLeaders. This is the we have a terrific panel to talk about the implications of this excellent recent Fordham report that you've got a copy of called Lacking Leaders, the Challenges of Principal Recruitment, Selection, and Placement. This is going to be a lively, I believe, discussion given the personalities and reputations of our panelists. It's my job to keep it lively, in part because this is sort of a momentous event for me personally. This is my last official act as president of the Fordham Institute. No, don't moan. It's a good thing. It's kind of free at last. At midnight tonight, I turn into a mouse, and Mike Petrilli turns into, I don't know, a horse or an ox or something, to pull the Cinderella's coach. So thanks everybody for being here. The report, which was carried out by the estimable team at Public Impact, looked at 5 urban districts in different parts of the country to find out how they were doing at recruiting and selecting and placing leaders in their schools. And there was some good news. Everybody's doing it better than they used to. People are coming up with metrics, districts are coming up with procedures. Favoritism and sort of who you know kind of politics seemed less important than it once was almost everywhere. It's becoming grown up, it's becoming professional, but there's still a heck of a long way to go, according to this analysis. To nobody's surprise, we discovered all over again that the principalship of a school, maybe especially an urban school, was a high-pressure and grueling job, heavy with responsibility, but with not nearly the same amount of authority to go with the responsibility. In other words, the job description itself needs work. We discovered that recruiting of talent beyond the district borders is limited and uneven and sometimes not very profitable, not very fruitful in terms of the districts. As a result, we discovered, again, pointing out almost the obvious or the inevitable, that most recruiting and selecting is done internally among people already on the district payroll. Not a bad thing, but the processes there are kind of lackadaisical. Sort of somebody knows somebody who knows somebody and suggests that they might want to get on a leadership track. Rather than anything that might be called sort of systematic cultivation of generations of leaders within the district. We found as well, or our analysts found as well, that the matching of people with schools is a little bit haphazard. It's more like we hire 12 principals and we have 12 vacancies, and eeny, meeny, miny, this one goes to that school and this one goes to that school. Not so much recruiting and identifying people on the basis of a particular school's particular needs or particular strengths. The way our analysts boil it down, you'll find this quote in the report, our primary finding is that principal hiring practices, even in pioneering districts, continue to fall short of what is needed, effectively causing needy schools to lose out on leaders with the potential to be great. Our research suggests, however, that better hiring practices alone are only part of the solution. Districts must also reimagine the principal's role so that it is a job that talented leaders want and are equipped to execute successfully, unquote. This leads to the sort of 4 obvious broad recommendations. First, make the principalship a more desirable job and compensate people who take it on appropriately. Second, districts need a serious systematic talent recruitment strategy. Okay. Third, districts and those who make policies that districts follow, which is often states, typically states, should eliminate hurdles that prevent the entry into the field of people who might be good at it, but are not necessarily bearing the appropriate paper credentials at the present time. And finally, a little more self-analytic, self-aware, data conscious in analyzing one's own practices and in keeping data on how it works out and analyzing which arrangements, which people, which placements work better than which, and also keeping a lot better information on successes and failures. We found, frankly, you'll see this in some tables in the report that have gaps and blanks in them. We found a lot of districts, and these are basically eager, good districts trying to do the right thing. A lot of just plain missing data. I mean, they didn't know. They didn't have it. And it wasn't because they were concealing it. They just hadn't thought about gathering it or keeping it or comparing it, those kinds of things. So that's what the report says. That's what the report recommends. And here to talk about it with us today is a living, breathing superintendent, Mike Miles from Dallas. And he's been living and breathing for a while now, in at least 2 superintendencies that I'm acquainted with. Talent officer from Prince George's County Public Schools, Doug Anthony, the guy in charge of essentially personnel, talent recruitment. A woman who is trying from outside the district to bring terrific leaders to the city of Milwaukee, Allison Wagner of Schools That Can Milwaukee, and last but not least, old friend and colleague Mike Casserly, who runs the Council of the Great City Schools, a membership organization of, last time I looked, about 60 of the country's major urban districts.
67?
67, you're growing.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. And who has for quite some time had his finger on the pulse of American urban education and is in frequent touch with those who lead it. So that is what we're here for, and we will have some questions and comments from the panel. I've got questions from me and comments from the panel, and maybe questions from the panel, and maybe comments from me. And then we will turn to all of you in the room and beyond with additional questions. Our target is to be done by 5:30. If cookies and grapes still remain, you're welcome to stick around and have some more of them. And we're delighted once again to see you and glad you came. So to start with a real softball that I previewed for all of the panelists, any major disagreements with the main findings and recommendations in this study? Take it away, Allison.
Oh, thank you. I wouldn't say disagreements. I just would underscore the importance of 2 things. First, I don't know that there was enough in here about the inputs. And I'll put my former hat on from new leaders. There's nothing more important than we can do than recruit and select the right people. And we shouldn't just assume that the people are out there in this country for us to recruit and select. We have found it's a real talent challenge in Milwaukee, and we've got to do a lot to develop the right inputs. And so it got to that with some of the things that the internal systems are doing and building, but I just think we need to underscore how important the inputs are, and currently how most higher ed institutions are not properly preparing people coming out of ed leadership programs. And the second thing that I don't think was in here, but is critical, at least I have found for recruiting in Milwaukee, is that the principal managers and the principal support that people are going to receive in the role are make it or break it. And so I didn't see that in there, but I think we've really got to keep in the conversation recruiting, admitting, training, but then also the support and evaluation pieces. And that has been really critical to our work in Milwaukee, to making sure people are going to have the right support and the right principal manager. That is part of the sell.
So just as people with teachers talk about induction and mentoring and various things for new teachers, you're saying that new principals need basically the same kinds of things?
I'm absolutely saying that is the premise our organization is based on. We have 8 school leadership coaches out in the field serving 175 school leaders in 37 schools
From outside the district.
from outside the district. And we work with these schools. We don't charge them anything. We privately raise all of our budget, but we are providing services to these school leaders who desperately need it and are not going to be able to move schools in theory without our support. So both the support they're receiving from organizations potentially like Schools of Milwaukee, but also from their mentors and hiring managers so that they can have the right autonomy to do the right things in the role.
I think I'm hearing 3 other panel members silently saying to themselves, why are they only in Milwaukee? We could use this in other places as well. Okay, Doug, any major disagreements?
I wouldn't say there, similarly to Allison, I wouldn't say there was major disagreement. What I would say is a particular, I guess, effect that was discussed was this notion of internal capacity and how we build internal capacity within a district as important as reaching out. And so maybe a little contrary to Allison, in our district, we've had a bottleneck for years because we haven't created the space and opportunities for those within the district to fill leadership roles, in particular around the principalship. So what's particularly important for us is how do we create succession planning opportunities and experiences for individuals within the district first, because we have the capacity and the skill set within the district. We just haven't nurtured it in a way that's been helpful. So we've been unpacking through some support from the Wallace Foundation, which has really helped us provide a different level of expediency around the work to start actualizing signature programs where we can distinguish and differentiate the type of support we give leaders within the district. And then trying to really create spaces where we can fill with both internal and external candidates. Because from our viewpoint, they go through the same rigorous selection process. If they're high flyer coming from another district, we want that talent as well. So we're not excluding them, we're just trying to make sure that there's a balance. And so that would be, like I said, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but a point I guess I would weigh a little bit differently.
How many principals in Prince George's County?
205.
And how many will, let's say this coming fall, be different, at least in the schools they're in, than they were last year approximately?
But that's a great question.
It's not all worked out yet?
It's not over. No,
Oh.
It's not over. We're in the process of actually still hiring and placing principals. What's been great is we're fortunate. We have a state superintendent of the year that's come on to our district, Dr. Kevin Maxwell. And with that has come a lot of energy and political goodwill. And so we've been able to create space for new positions in the district. So we have a lot of wonderful, talented principals, seasoned principals, moving into positions. I'm looking at one in the audience now. Former principal is now going to be a mentor principal in our district for the newbies. And so we're in the process of kind of still ironing those things out. So right now we're about 16 new positions.
About 16 schools that will have different people at the head than they had last year.
Correct.
Okay. We got a factoid from somebody a couple days ago that was a result of a survey that said out of 114,000 school principals working during 2011-12, this is both public and private, 114,000, 78% stuck around the following year in the same school, which is to say that 22% did not. Of the 22%, this is an NCES report actually, as I'm reminded, 6% went to different schools and 12% left entirely. Now, I understand that adds up to 18, and I was looking for 22. But there goes the National Center for Education Statistics again, failing to add it up to 100. Okay.
The remainder are don't know.
Say it again?
The remainder are don't know.
Don't know where they were in one of those 2 years. A little uncertain. Okay, we'll come back to the Prince George's example and what you're doing, and what you're changing there. But let's hear from another real place. This will make the third real place: Milwaukee, Prince George's, and now to Texas. What do you find in our findings that gives you pause, or that you would change?
Well, first let me say I really liked the report. I thought it was spot on the recommendations, and wish I'd had the report 3 years ago. We're doing a lot of things around principal recruitment and principal evaluation. and this report is only going to help. Last year, to give some context to the audience, we have 223 principals in Dallas, and
Just a little bit larger than Prince George. I mean, very similar in scale. Okay.
And then last year, or the beginning of this year, we had 62 principals were new to their buildings.
Whoa.
55 were new to the district.
Whoa.
Going forward, next year, this 14-15 school year, we'll have 45 or so principals who are new to the building, about 25 who are new to the district. So that's a lot of principals to have to recruit and hire in a short time. With regard to the report, I thought there was one area that might have you might have benefited by talking a little bit more about principal evaluations. It's hard to recruit and compare if you can't evaluate principals accurately, or if you don't have the data around the principals that you already have, and comparing what makes a good principal. If you can't really look at that data and evaluate principals accurately, how are you going to hire people, how are you going to recruit people that really is going to hit the mark. So I think that's one piece I would have liked to have seen a little bit more. And then for Dallas, and it may be a little bit different than others, the time and scale issue. It was mentioned in the report a little bit, but we want to try to hire all the principals by the end of May, so that they're planning for next year. They may even be involved in the hiring process. If you look at hiring, 40 principals or so, from March to May, that's a lot of principals to hire. So that it's a rush time frame. So the report mentioned, the multiple interviews and things would be preferred. The assessment center that we have, we put all of our candidates through an assessment center so that they have to pass that in order to get into a pool. But by the time you add all that up, it starts to drag out in months, and we're going to lose good candidates to other districts if we don't speed that process up.
So you're saying there's a sort of fundamental trade-off between speed and thoroughness here.
In the case where we have to have this many principals,
Yeah.
I think over time we'll reach steady state, which will just be a dozen principals a year.
Like he's describing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that might be more manageable as far as having multiple interviews and things like that. But in the short term, the last 2 years, it's been pretty heavy lift just to get those positions filled by the 1st of June.
So to keep you on the spot for a minute, Mike, before we get to the other Mike, is this huge turnover because people ran screaming upon your arrival, or because you decided that a lot of Dallas schools needed a change, or both?
Well, there's a hurricane that happened right after I signed a contract. And people tried to make the connection between the two, but I don't think I had anything to do with that. So seriously, I think we upped the rigor, that's for sure, and accountability. But I think overall, the principalship is the toughest position in the district, and it's also the most critical to reform. And I think people looked at that pretty seriously on both ends, people who are in the positions in left and people who are trying to recruit. So I think maybe a combination of both.
Okay, Mike Casserly. So we've heard from 3 real places. Now hear from the heights of Washington, D.C. What's your take on this?
Or the depths.
Or the depths.
Before I talk about the report a little bit, if I could take just a moment. You mentioned the fact that this was your last official duty as president of the foundation, and you and I have known each other for a very long time. Matter of fact, I think I first met you probably in the early 80s when you worked for Senator Moynihan on Capitol Hill, and we were duking it out in the Senate Finance Committee. It wasn't just the two of us, but it was a number of
Senator Long, Senator Pack. There were a few other people there at the time. Yes.
JP, Long, all of those folks from a long time ago. And over the years, there have been times when we've agreed, and there's been times when we've disagreed. But certainly, on the times where we agreed, we always found ways to work together. And where we disagreed, we always were able to have a conversation with each other that was civil and constructive. And I have to say, over those 30 some odd years that I've known you, I've learned a great deal from you. I have treasured and valued your wisdom and expertise, and have always listened to you hard, even if I had a different perspective. So I just want to thank you for that, and wish you good luck. And I know you're not leaving for good, because if I screw up, I know you'll be around to tell me so. So thank you.
Thank you for that, and you can have another cookie too.
Great, I will take one.
I really appreciate that, and reciprocate. We haven't always worked respectingly with every Washington organization that we have encountered, but the Council of Great City Schools has been on the whole a treat to have in Washington and to work with, as well as you personally, so thank you for that.
So,
now back to business.
Now back to business. In general, I have to say, like all of the other panelists, that I largely agree with the overall findings of the report. It's hard to disagree with the fact that this is a very tough job. It's not paid as well as it should be, that recruitment and placement and selection is not everything it should be. The match isn't always perfect between the skills of the principals and the needs of the schools, et cetera, et cetera. So in large part, I'd have to say that, like my fellow panelists, I'm in a general accord with what it is the report found. If there were places at all that I had issues, it was sometimes with what was not there. And I think there was some reference to that as well. But there was some discussion about kind of reimagining the role of the principal, but the report seemed to be sometimes at odds with itself about whether or not management versus instruction ought to take preeminence in that conversation. And I found both of those findings in the report. And it struck me as something that even the report's authors hadn't quite reconciled yet. You made reference to data, and I understand the trouble with finding data, but one of the things that I would have liked to have seen in the absence of the data is some guidance to the districts about what it is they ought to be collecting and for what purposes to make the report that much more useful. Also, I think it wasn't in the report proper, but it might have been in your forward. You said that there was lots to learn from charter schools and private schools and corporations and the like. And while the report itself had a number of different examples from corporations, it never really did say what it was that regular school districts could learn from private schools or charter schools, and how those lessons might differ from what it is that the regular schools, in fact, were actually doing.
Don't say the regular schools, the district schools.
The district schools,
Okay.
Thank you. In addition, there were some places where the report, in talking about the selection of principals, indicates that districts ought to spend more time looking at research and all of that. It didn't say exactly what research you thought was particularly valuable to look at that would help guide our discussions. I think, like your observation, there were places where I found it very frustrating that the report didn't mention retention or support systems or capacity building or higher education or leadership development or accountability and the like. All things that, in combination with the context of supports that are around principals and the constraints on them, that I sometimes felt like they were talking about the principal in isolation without an adequate discussion of all the things around them that made the job difficult or not. Now there were times when it's not that I had disagreements about some of the things in the report, but there were times when on the recommendations I felt that it might have been more helpful to talk a little bit about what made some of the recommendations that you made so hard to to do. Because it's not like districts haven't tried to do many of those things, and in fact are doing some of those things, as you pointed out. But what it is that's made some of those recommendations so hard to do, and what it is you would propose to get around those things. So in many ways, it was not what I found in the report that I would disagree with. It was, there were holes sometimes that I would have liked to have seen the authors plug a little more effectively.
I think we are guilty as charged on at least most of those. Of course, it was meant to be a report, not an encyclopedia of the principalship. And I know that your organization has been doing a good deal of work in this realm itself and has a number of publications, studies, reports, analyses available on this crucial issue, because I think everybody agrees this is a crucial issue. Everybody agrees it's a troubled issue. I keep being puzzled about why it's so hard to solve. I keep thinking 114,000 principals in the country. There are football stadiums that could house them all at the same time. This is not a kind of an unimaginably large army of people like the 3 million teachers. And it ought to be possible to do something more in this realm than we've done so far. Some of what makes it hard, though, has already been alluded to. It's a bottleneck in the system with respect to either openings or mechanisms for cultivating talent for the openings. It's timelines and the clash, the internal clash between filling 40 jobs between, what did you say, March and May, Mike? Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are some internal obstacles that lead me anyway to wonder why is so much of it always end up being so last minute? Why don't we know in many cases, not every case, I mean, people can always have emergencies in their lives and things, but why don't we know in many cases a year in advance whether a school is going to need a different principal? When some of the new leaders type organizations and KIPP type organizations set out to develop a person as a principal, they give them a year's head start on kind of learning the ropes or getting used to a school or acquiring the skills. Are we stuck forever with this kind of we'll let you know in March if we're lucky whether you're coming back next year, or you will let us know in March if we're lucky whether you are coming back next year, and then we got to scramble during March, April, and May to deal with it? Is there any way to get a head start on these difficult recruitment and selection and placement tasks? Any of you, actually? How can we get this going earlier?
So we tried to get ahead of that. I don't think there's always going to be folks who notify you at the end of the school year.
I am not coming back.
Right.
Yes.
And
okay.
That'll happen at the end of the school year if your data is right, and 1 in 3 principals, or maybe it was somebody else's data. 1 in 3 principals leave and go somewhere else within a 3-year period. Mm-hmm. Then you're going to have that late turnover. The way we've been trying to get ahead of it, and we're just only starting, we had a School Leaders Academy initiated when I got there 2 years ago. And that's where we train teachers and assistant principals or anybody who wants to be a principal for an entire year. It's more than residency because we actually pay them a salary, and they $60,000, and that's what they do for the entire year, is learn to be a great school principal in Dallas ISD. So they do some walkthroughs among our schools. They hook up with a experienced principal for half the year. They get training on a regular basis, et cetera. And that actually helped quite a bit. Once
it's a full year, full time for those people.
Full year, full time in training. It's called the School Leaders Academy. Mm-hmm. And this coming year is the 3rd year of that. We also have some pretty good partners. The pipeline that we needed for the last couple of years is we needed a lot more principals than I think I said. Steady state will be about a dozen. But we have a great partner in Teaching Trust. That's an SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And they provide a pipeline of teachers. Right now, it's only 7 or 8 principals a year. So that in a normal case, that would be great. But in the last couple of years, it's not enough. So I think those are the 2 areas that we've been working on to try to get ahead of this curve.
I'll come back to you in a second, Mike. Allison, does Milwaukee getting ahead of the curve?
This past year, we did a really exciting event that I'd like to highlight. I think that we hosted a weekend called Grow in Milwaukee, and we had 50 different leadership candidates from 11 different states come. We got funding from the Kern Family Foundation to fly people in, to put them up, and to really sell them on the movement happening in Milwaukee. And the district was part of that weekend, but the exciting thing was that we had private choice schools, as they're called in Milwaukee, charter schools and district schools, all together with a catalog of opportunities. So we had over 40 school leadership opportunities that we were showcasing the first weekend in March, that we had cataloged in January and February across all 3 sectors. And we had 14 hires come out of that weekend, which was really exciting. It was a great way to bring new talent to Milwaukee. And so I think one thing districts can do is to partner with other charter and, in our case, choice schools to really get the word out about what's happening in the city. And another thing to do is, as Mike was saying, rely on partners. So we have Teach for America, which is a very strong partner of ours. We hosted that weekend in conjunction with them. And we're also partnering with other principal preparation programs, Woodrow Wilson, BES, Accelerated Institute, to get new talent to Milwaukee. So I would say partnerships and trying to get ahead early with a catalog of opportunities across opportunities within the city.
Good. This was almost like a leadership festival this weekend that you're describing.
It was.
With people, for both local people and fly-in people, both?
Yes, most people were flown in or driving in from Madison or Chicago. I will say Milwaukee is a little bit harder of a sell. So most of them
Dallas?
or then maybe DC or other cities.
Milwaukee's a great city.
It is a great city. I'm here to tell you that. We have more to offer than just beer, brats, and cheese. But most people who came in did have ties to Wisconsin. So TFA heavily recruits from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, or people had indicated they had an interest in getting back to Wisconsin where maybe they were home or they had family. So we were very targeted in who we invited. We had 50 slots. We filled all 50. And most people had some excuse to get back to Milwaukee, and we were lucky to have 14 of them convert.
Doug, you want to say a word about this getting ahead of the curve so that you're not finding yourself on the last day of July still struggling with who's going to be where?
Yeah, sure. So also one clarification. Last year I served as the acting chief of human resources for the district. This year my role is more designated for developing the capacity of individuals in the district. So my focus is more around that and looking at succession planning. But to your point, I think one of the things is that we're in our district, we're trying to be a lot smarter about projecting and making forecasting decisions around that. So there's easy to establish patterns when there's change in leadership to say, okay, there may be some influx here, so we need to pay attention to that. But the other thing is, and you mentioned this in your opening remarks, is that we didn't actually have some of the tools necessary to identify the leadership within the district. And so we're developing, again, this is great support and, from the Wiles Foundation to help us really think about developing a leader tracking system. So we've actually in a process of developing a tracking system where even internally we know who we have. The other thing, Allison kind of alluded to this as well, is that we've developed some really strong partnerships with local universities to really impact what's happening at the preparation level. And so we have partnerships with Bowie State, University of Maryland. We're working on a new, forging hopefully relationship with Johns Hopkins University to help shape some of the work we're doing there, along with McDaniel College. And so in those efforts, we're trying to just be thoughtful about also identifying sourcing for these folks so that we can be strategic in identifying who's coming on board. We're not so much last minute as that we're paying attention to fit. And so I would love to tell you that we also have our own program called ALPS, Aspiring Leaders Program for Student Success. And in that, we take our folks 25 through a year-long training opportunity, and they have work experiences and so on. They're sitting assistant principals, and so the context of their work is to shape what the next level of leadership looks like in a building. And we developed that with the National Institute of School Leadership. And in that, we've based a curriculum where we're now wrapping around support from central office. So I think in those steps, we're trying to be a lot more deliberate and intentional.
So just to be clear, that program is for people who are functioning as assistant principals, and they're also participating in this program.
Correct.
It's a little different from what he's describing as a sort of full-time job being trained.
Correct.
Okay. So Mike, back to the Casserly, back to the mountain.
At this point, I'm not sure that I have a whole lot to add. I think what is being described out of Prince George's County and out of Dallas are more and more common across the districts. And I know the report took issue somewhat with the internal hiring pattern of a lot of school districts, and described it sometimes as being limp, and sometimes it is limp. On the other hand, it's also, it can be actually quite strategic because you're able to grow the skills that you want, and particularly for an urban school district, you're able to realize the diversity that you need, unlike some other less diverse communities. So relying on an inside strategy is actually helpful to these districts in lots of ways. So I know the report didn't completely take it to task, but there were points in the report where it was kind of disparaging of the effort, when in fact a lot of school districts are being much more strategic about their internal talent.
Yeah, I think it's disparaging about the absence of a strategy for internal recruitment and development.
And that would also be the case for external talent.
Sure. If external recruitment amounts to posting a notice in Ed Week and then waiting to see if anything comes through the transom, that's not exactly a strategy.
Correct.
That's sort of like going through the motions of saying equal opportunity employer, but not much. Okay. Let's come to this question of how, which one of you brought up a little earlier, of how you know whether a principal is good at their job, because that's going to then carry us to the question of how do you know whether somebody is going to be good at this job. I mean, the easy thing is to say, we'll judge the principal by the performance of the school, and we'll judge the performance of the school by test scores. And that is often said, and it's not completely invalid. But besides looking at how the students in the school are doing on external measures, and assuming that the principal is to some degree responsible for that, how else do you evaluate the effectiveness and fit and suitability of a principal on the job?
So it's a great question.
I hope they all are, but let's keep going on this one.
That was period. That was great. So yeah, I think one thing is you have to, in some regards, you have to look at the evaluation and how thoughtful we are at creating leader standards across the district. So there's alignment between what the expectations of the leader are with what the actual outcomes in terms of what they should be demonstrating in practice. And so there's a couple of ways that I think we try to get at it in the district, and one is obviously having very effective principal supervisors. In our district, we call them instructional directors. They're going to give you the lens and the day-to-day kind of perspective, both anecdotal, qualitative, and quantitative data about how principals and aspiring principals in the ranks and assistant principals on the job are doing in the context of their schools. And so that's a good a lever and data point. We also have in our district, we leverage Val-Ed assessment for our assistant principals and principals, which is a part of their evaluation, but we've leveraged it first as a professional development experience. And it's basically a 360 assessment that gives teachers and employees in a school building an opportunity to provide feedback in a very meaningful way that we can track and help share with a principal and assistant principal about strengths and weaknesses in their practice. Another thing that we do, I think pretty well is we provide lots of opportunities for professional development in the district. You know, and so we didn't have like a Madison, your function, the grow weekend, but we've done things like, so you want to be an administrator, and provide opportunities for people to come learn about what it means to be an administrator in a district. And so I think those are some of the things that we do to kind of leverage that, but evaluation is a really important piece of really in leader standards across the district, so people understand what the expectations are, helping that.
And the people doing the evaluation have rubrics or criteria to
Yes.
look at when they're doing it?
Absolutely. We have look for quick checks. We have official frameworks and expectations that are tied to their job performance as well. So we're trying to continually build this alignment in the system. It's a work in progress, but for the last couple of years, we've been fine-tuning that.
Okay, Mike?
The principal evaluation issue is a really important one, and I know one of the things that we found in our work is that while almost all of the big cities have an formal evaluation process of some kind, some of them were tighter than others, some of them were pretty vague and loose, but it was noticeable to us that the principal evaluations were often out of alignment with the teacher evaluations, so they were looking for something fundamentally different that was beyond their differing roles. It was a misalignment of the system that didn't put people at odds with one another, but basically signaled that the system hadn't quite got its priorities straight. The one thing that we often did not find in principal evaluations that I personally think would be more useful to insert would be the ability of the principals to retain high-quality, effective teachers. When teachers often say that they leave in part because of the principal, they leave for other reasons too. But the principal's ability to retain top talent is not only critical to the cohesion of the school, but critical to student achievement.
Mike, Miles, how do you evaluate?
It's a very important piece of the discussion, I think, the principal evaluation. When we say in Dallas that we have some great principals, and we do, we know with certainty that the principals are great, because we evaluate them very rigorously in a very aligned process. The teacher eval is aligned to the principal eval, is aligned to the people who coach and monitor and evaluate the principals. We have an executive director over a feeder pattern that's about 10 to 12 schools.
10 or 12 schools per executive director.
Per executive director, there's 22 feeder patterns in Dallas. So each executive director has 10 to 12 principals to coach and monitor. So they're in the buildings all the time. 2 years ago, we passed the most rigorous, I think, principal evaluation system in the nation. Challenge you to go find another one more rigorous, because it's tied to student achievement, multiple measures of student achievement, that's 40%. And then the performance piece is 60%, and that's based on several, also multiple measures. Instructional rubric, of course, how they give feedback, the spot observations and the coaching of teachers, we evaluate that. We look at the mid-year review, so we look at their action plan. We look at climate surveys around what the teachers think about the direction of the school and the morale of the school. We look at systems processes, so there's a systems review, and they get a systems score in April. So our principals are really strong, but it's because it's like what you said, Doug. If you're going to hold them to high accountability, you have to provide a whole bunch of support. And so to have an executive director who's a coach, we use that word very specifically for our principals, that free up the principal from some of the administrative stuff that most principals have to do, and then is in the building every week to help the principal grow and do their job. And all the professional development that we provide our principals, I think we have a pretty good team, and it's partly because of how we evaluate.
So just tell me, is the coach also a key evaluator, or are those roles separate?
It's one and the same. So, we look at it like a coach on a football field.
Yeah.
You don't come in with a clipboard and say, you're doing this right and this wrong, and then we'll see you in, 4 weeks. Coach doesn't do that. A coach is right there as a shoulder partner. So the executive director, who's also evaluated rigorously, who has 30% of their evaluation tied to achievement, that will start this year. Principals we've been doing for 2 years. And then the teacher eval will start this year also.
Your new teacher evaluation system that your board just signed off on a month or two ago.
Right, in May.
Okay. Any clues here on principal evaluation to add to the conversation before I turn it to principal prediction?
Yeah, I would just say Schools of Milwaukee is in a supporting coaching role, providing support to choice, charter, and district schools outside of the evaluation world. But I would say that everything you're echoing about targeted support in the field, then followed up with ongoing professional development, that's the model we follow. Our support is around learning and teaching, culture, and people. And we have very clear steps that we help our schools implement within those 3 tracks. And our coaching in the field is then followed up by our monthly professional developments, where we bring the leaders together who are going through the same challenges and experiences. So can't underscore enough the importance of the ongoing coaching and support that is the model for Schools like Milwaukee.
One other thing on evaluation,
Yeah.
I think everybody's kind of covered what you evaluate principals on, but there's kind of an emerging trend here in terms of who does the evaluation. It's not just the principal supervisors, as it's kind of always been, but a number of school districts are starting to involve parents and students as part of the evaluation process of principals.
So a kind of a 360-degree evaluation goes beyond the school, goes beyond the professional staff.
Right. It's not the norm, but it's starting to emerge.
Interesting. By the way, I meant to say this earlier. You illustrate, but Doug and Mike have both mentioned the outside partner role in this whole business. And I don't think our report deals very much with the degree to which either a private foundation or a university or a nonprofit organization that is teaming up with the district can fill gaps, find people, do a whole bunch of things that the district all by itself would have more difficulty doing. Okay, just to get that on the table. So how do you predict the effectiveness of a new principal? Let's take the challenging case, somebody that is not currently working in your district. If there was somebody currently working in your district, presumably you have some evidence of their track record in whatever role they were in, teacher, assistant principal, whatever. But if it's somebody coming from the other side of the country, if they're coming from Dallas to Prince George's County, Prince George's County to Milwaukee, or Milwaukee to Dayton, Ohio, how do you know ahead of time? What do you look for ahead of time that gives you a clue as to whether they're going to be good at it? Doug.
Okay. That's a great question.
They all are.
They're all great. You said they're all great. Now I'm
Agree.
But keep saying it.
I'll
I
keep
need
saying
reinforcement.
So I think that is some of the rub sometimes, because contextually, and I think Mike talked about this a few minutes ago, the context of every district is different. And so being able to have leader standards that I think reflect expectations, indicators, and so on, and behaviors of effective principals is important. So I think having a rigorous screening process is the first step. And for us, it's looking at practice. And so we're trying to get better at this, but if you think about how teachers go through their practice, and in some districts, you actually have teachers teach, so you can see them.
A demo lesson or something like that, yeah, right?
So for us, for principals, what we try to do is we try to give them a couple different things. So we have them go through a scenario looking at problems and how they react to problems, how they determine whether or not they're going to be inclusive in making some of the decisions. And so they have a module they go through. We also have them look at teacher practice, because I think you mentioned one of the most important and fundamental things a principal can do is help a teacher improve their practice. Principals have to be able to know how to do that. So we give them a quick snapshot, they watch a video, And then they have to talk about what that conference would be like with that teacher. They have to articulate it both in writing so that we can understand how they see them helping or hindering or advancing a teacher's practice. So those are some of the methods that we do. I'm not going to tell all our trade secrets.
No, they might get swiped by Dallas or Milwaukee.
Yeah, you know. But I
Or
think,
Dayton.
But I think it's part of. I think that's part of being thoughtful about going beyond a typical interview. I think the other thing that we do that's pretty unique is that we used to have a process where we had a panel of the community and teachers kind of sit in and weigh in on a decision for a principal decision. Personally, I won't say this is Prince George's, but I will say this is personally. I felt that was a disingenuous process in some respects because it was kind of a setup sometimes, right? So we looked at also, I don't think it was inclusive enough. So we developed a survey and a process that broadens input from the community. We go out into the community, we ask for what are the most important characteristics that you want to see in a leader in your building. And we grapple and we chart and we put all this information up together so that it informs the district's decision making when making matches. And we have two things we call baseball cards. It's a baseball card which gives you like a snapshot of what the community wanted, and then there's a baseball card that gives you all the data about the principles that we have in the pipeline. And so we match. So it's not a random choice of saying, okay, we got 12 and 12. It's more like, okay, we have this person with these characteristics, this experience, and we have this school community that's looking for someone like this. And so then the associates and executive leadership in the district really have opportunities to kind of make a very informed decision, recommendation, I should say, to the superintendent, who ultimately has the authority to pick.
What do you look for when you're hiring from outside?
So quickly, we're looking at a lot of principal data right now. This is the second year we have extensive data on the principalship and what really are the correlates. The scatter plots that we look at, the Pearsons are the correlations rather between individual metrics that we look at for principals and then the success of the building. And so we're going to have a better idea. One thing we're not doing that as a result of this report we'll start doing a little bit better of, and that is looking at our assessment center, our recruitment data, and tying that. I think once we have the principal data and the recruitment data and we can match that together, we're going to have a better fit. But there's one other thing that's the only point I'd like to make right here now is there's some things that we're just starting to look at how to assess. You know, the principalship is not just about the metrics and about management and the pieces of data that I told you was on the evaluation. There's some intangibles, change management, courage, and the vision piece. You know, I say to principals, you get paid for three things: leadership, vision, and making the tough decisions nobody else wants to make. And so how do you assess that at the very beginning? I know we're trying to do that with teachers. TFA is trying to look at this notion of grit. Google looks at, a notion of grit or other types of characteristics. And we got to start looking at that too. We're just scratching the surface because the leaders who fail are the ones who can't manage change well or don't have the courage to make the tough decisions. And so we've got to do better at that.
The last big area I want to get into before we open this up is the definition and nature of the job itself. I think we plead guilty as charged to Mike Casserly's observation that we are, in our report, can't make up our mind whether we're talking about instructional leadership or executive talent. So I'd like to get into that dilemma about the definition of the principal's role. It's a topic on which people have very different opinions in general. I'd like to get into how to give the principal, however you picture their role, how to give them the authority to succeed in their job with respect to key things like personnel and budget and stuff like that for anybody in charge of something. And then I'd like to get to this question of pay. We were struck by how small is the difference between the pay of a very senior teacher and the average pay of a principal in many districts. How small is the differential? And really wondering whether that's the right way to conceive of the compensation structure for somebody leading a building, or whether we ought to be rethinking that. So I'd welcome on these sort of linked issues of Job definition, job empowerment, job compensation. Where are you heading? Where do you see yourselves heading? Where should you be heading? Anybody can start. You want to start, Allison?
Sure. Again, we're in a little bit of a unique role.
Yes, you're outside the district.
Outside of the district.
Stipulate that.
Right. So the most important thing that Schools of Milwaukee does in this arena is really define with the school the leadership team and the team members' roles. And a lot of this report was centered around just the school leader, but we would argue it takes a full team to move a school, and that's what our team of coaches is trying to do, build the right team of leaders so that everyone knows what their clear roles and responsibilities are and they know how to stay in their lane. In fact, Schools Like Milwaukee sends different teams of coaches to schools to work with individuals within their lanes. So we have people who focus on culture, we have people who focus on personnel, we have people who focus on teaching and learning, and they're going to the schools to work with people who are going to accelerate and transform schools within that arena. So the very most important thing you can do is build the right leadership team and make it very clear for the school's roles and responsibilities.
So not a leader,
It's
but
not
a
leader.
team.
It's a team. It
Okay.
takes a team.
It takes a team. That sounds like a
Yes.
famous book.
It takes
okay.
a team, and our team would argue that. And the other thing I think that it's important to say here, we work with a lot of charter and private choice schools that can't compete with the same compensation structures. We're trying to work with them to better that, and we're trying to work with another nonprofit in town that does board development to make sure the right fundraising and board members are in place to get more dollars to our schools. But the thing I will say is that if you have the right mission-aligned people where they feel like they're going to be successful, they're going to have autonomy, they're going to have authority to truly move the school, that is always more important to great leaders than compensation. And we have found that. I saw that in Chicago. If you surveyed CPS principals, they would tell you they wanted more control from their chief area officer than they wanted more money. And so I do think compensation is an issue, but more important is to have the right hiring manager, the right support, and to really feel like you have the autonomy to do the job.
Mike Casserly.
Yeah, the pay issue, I have to say, was the one part of the report where I tried to figure out if I had some caveat to it, but I don't. I think the fact of the matter is that these people aren't paid enough and guilty as charged.
Right.
On the responsibility part, the one recommendation I think I worried about when I read the report was the kind of blanket recommendation to devolve decisions uniformly on budget, personnel, say materials, program, and the like to principals. I think that's mostly a good recommendation, but it's not always a good recommendation because where you've got a weak principal or you're in a chronically low-performing school, some of that autonomy needs to be reined in. So the recommendation by itself needs context and caveats to it. Otherwise, giving people, this is not a situation that autonomy solves.
You're describing something I think of more as earned autonomy rather than blanket autonomy.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Correct. Yes.
Mike?
I would agree with that. But maybe looking at it slightly differently, I think about all the decisions that a principal or somebody in the building needs to make. And can some of those decisions be made by somebody else, not the principal? And I think the answer is yes. And so, when you're talking about visioning, organizational effectiveness, making sure people are in the right places, that may be one type of decision maker. But when you're talking about budgeting, making sure the books are there on time, the buses are running, that may be another different type of skill set. They both have to do with decisions. So one way to look at whether it should be an executive or manager is to say, what are all the decisions that need to be made in a year, and can some of those decisions be made by somebody else? And I
It's
think
another
the answer is
angle on the
probably-
team of leadership idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
So and I think the answer is yes to that question.
Okay. How about pay in Dallas while we're on that subject?
We this year, you'll see, this is the first year that the compensation will be tied to achievement and performance. So next month, the principals who returned will get their new salaries, and it will be $2.4 million higher than it was last year as
The total.
as a group,
Not per person.
not per person. Yeah, that'd be nice. We're not that rich in Dallas,
That's
but
good recruiting.
So wait a minute, you're also.
but the answer,
Yeah.
the short of it is, yes, principals need to be paid much more than what we're paying them. Even with that increase, we think we may increase it even more in the future, because that's what it takes to compete, but that's also what principals deserve.
You're also saying people are coming back to these jobs agreed to come back to the job before knowing how much they were going to get paid this next year.
Yeah, well, they know that the floor
Okay.
was the current year's salary.
Okay.
So that was the floor.
Okay. Prince George's, the role of the principal and the pay of the principal?
Okay, as a former principal.
Yes. I'm sure you weren't paid enough.
No, never. And I'm glad to report that our Board of Education, our CEO, superintendent, our and union partners are really working to write.
Excuse me, are your principals in a union?
Yes.
They are?
Yes, they are.
Is it the same union as the teachers?
No.
What union do the principals belong to in Prince George's County?
ASASP.
ASASP,
Yeah.
whatever that stands for.
Sorry,
Okay.
it's escaping me what those.
Okay.
But yeah, they're in a union that's separate from the teachers union.
Okay.
But anyway, they've been working and diligently, and this year, all the administrators will see an increase in their salaries. In addition to that, what I think is significant is the complexity of the job as such, particularly with new evaluation systems, implementation of Common Core and otherwise, that for me, the part of what I'm actually personally working on my doctorate, it's about how do you retain principals in large urban school districts. So even your references are here, and I'm like, yeah, I got that. I know that.
Glad to be helpful. Glad to be helpful.
So for total transparency, right? So, but I think what's significant about that is that for me, it's really looking at what are the structures, the conditions, and types of support that we put in place. Because I'm interested in retention. You know, what's causing you to want to leave, and are there things that the district can do differently to retain you? And so I think when we start looking at some of those things and the type of supports and what's the best working conditions, so much of the research talks about principals who are in schools that don't have some of the complex challenges that many large urban district or schools have in particular, stay longer. And then what do most districts do? They put the brand new principal in the toughest school. And so we've been very thoughtful about, making good on those type of things. But I would say that the conditions, the structures, and the type of supports that we put in place are what's necessary. And most of the research even still says today that it's not about compensation. That's important, don't get me wrong. But it's about the conditions and the complexity of the job that's impacting the behavior. So I'm interested in uncovering that as well.
Okay. We're going to open it up to those of you here. I believe we have microphones in the room so that people can be broadcast to the world and recorded for perpetuity. But what about, and our worldwide audience is again invited to tweet in at #LackingLeaders. And I see a smiling face in the back suggesting that somebody's already tweeted in. So I'm going to be given some card with a very primitive way of transmitting the tweeted question to the moderator in cursive. Cursive. We believe in cursive at the Fordham Institute. We agree with Florida that cursive is an important thing for people to learn.
North Carolina just.
North Carolina, too. They are onto cursive.
North Carolina.
I think this is one of the modifications in the Common Core standards that is perfectly reasonable. Okay, the floor is open. Who's got I know a few of you, but I'm going to ask you to identify yourselves as well as asking a question. Bingo. Microphone. It's coming. You are.
Is it working? Yes.
Yes.
Howard Nelson, American Federation of Teachers. I guess I'm going to address this question to the Dallas superintendent, but it's the issue of using student achievement data, it's sort of unsatisfactory to say we use data, therefore we'll get better principals. The question is, which data do you use? Most economists would argue the only way you can measure school effectiveness is a really good value-added model. And in Dallas, I know you have a choice to use value-added or to use simplistic achievement gains. So how do you actually use that data for principals?
I predict you're going to get a complex answer because Dallas is a complex system. But go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be brief. We look at multiple measures, mostly, and we look at those measures, either the state exams or our own generated semester exams, so first semester and second semester exams. And we look at it in three different ways. One is straight proficiency, the percentage of kids who are proficient or above. The second way is a value added or growth metric. And in Dallas, we've had one for a dozen years. It's called Classroom Effectiveness Index and School Effectiveness Index. But essentially, it's a growth index. And then the third way is a norm reference model just based on our students. So we place kids in 4 or 5 different academic peer groups. And the question is, the kids in your school, compared to all the other kids in the district, and since we have 160,000 students, it's usually a big sample or big group, can they beat the median for that peer group, that academic peer group? So we look at 3 ways, and we give the school the best of the 3. The same thing goes with the teachers. So we think we're looking at data in a pretty sophisticated way. We subtract out the chronically absent students. We subtract out the kids who have a score but weren't there for most of the semester or something like that. So we're trying to be as fair as possible to both the teacher but also the school and the principal.
Okay, others in the room with a question for the panel. Yes, ma'am. Run, run, run.
No pressure.
Hi, my name is Irma Zardoya. I'm the CEO and president of the New York City Leadership Academy, and I want to thank the panelists for such a great conversation. And just a quick observation that I had in looking at the research, especially as it related to leadership competencies, and I think, Mike, you spoke about that, and certainly, Doug, you did also, and the fact that they really focused on leadership competencies around recruitment and selection. But I think that, Mike, you've also focused on that at the evaluation and support side. And what we have found at the Academy and working across the states has been the struggle that districts have in trying to look at it as a continuum across the entire spectrum. And the challenge around how do they also build that capacity throughout their system, especially teacher leadership and the great resource that we have in teachers and building that leadership throughout that leadership pipeline. Maybe one of you could talk about how you really look at teacher leadership, focus on your preparation, and how that leads to the pipeline. Might also just say that the Wallace Foundation has really supported 6 districts in really looking at this whole continuum, and they've done really well, and now have really focused on principal supervisors, which I know, Mike, you have really put some resources on.
Good. Who wants to take it up?
I guess I'll take a stab at it.
Go for it.
Thanks, Irma. I think for us, and Irma's right in terms of really looking at a continuum, because it is hard to take the process from the interview and recruitment all the way to the end of a principal who's still receiving mentoring support in their 3rd year. And so how do you build a robust pipeline that includes the induction portion of the assignment, first the identification, then the induction, then the support and training as they go through the life cycle of support. And so for us, it was the first thing that we had to do as a district is really examine what are our leader standards, what's important to us in terms of having a leader. Now that may sound like, that's common sense, But in my practice and experience, and even in our district, we had evaluations, we had all these different things that talked around leadership. We didn't have specific leader standards that identified this is what the expectation is. So that helps build that alignment from, you know, the types of interview questions we asked, the type of tools that we used around the characteristics of identifying those external candidates and internal candidates, all the way through the process of, you know, the interviews with the instructional directors. And then you have to think about what are the preparation programs. So when I talked about some of our university partnerships, we also talked about how we've embedded our leader standards into their practice, so that as they're talking about teacher leaders and they're building administrative certification programs, those universities are using Prince George's County context because they have our leader standards. And so it's kind of a whole wraparound of support, and then you take it into our internal preparation programs as well as the type of professional development that we provide to tie it into the evaluation. So from beginning to end, you have this connection between where we've recruited an individual based on these leader standards, and now we're evaluating them on these standards. And our mentors are providing support on these standards with our new principals. And so I think it is a continuum. I think it is a tough thing to do, but I think the guidepost for us has been the leader standards.
Well, it sounds like something that cuts across many sort of departments within the system, and many different roles and responsibilities in the administration too. Are you the glue in this?
I take no credit for being the glue of anything. I'm a historian in some respect. I've been in the system for 23 years, and so and have been given a charge around leadership development in the district, along with the associate superintendents and instructional directors, the principals, assistant principals. And so I take pride in trying to provide that type of support. It's a work in progress. We haven't gotten it perfected by any means, and we're working through it.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, one area where I think the leadership development is starting to align itself a lot better, and this is an area I think Irma knows about and the Wallace Foundation knows about really well, is not only sorting out this management versus instruction question at the principal's level, but up from there, the principal supervisor level,
Right.
realigning that responsibility from not simply an administrative sign-off on the school trips kind of administrative role, but serving as a more specific instructional leader for the schools under their aegis.
Okay, one of our outside or audience tweeters, and it, by the way, came up in beautiful printing rather than cursive, but it's still readable, is the move to prescriptive teacher evaluations, sometimes coming from the state, for example, hurting efforts to recruit great leaders, because these evaluation systems are designed, at least in part, to principal-proof the school, i.e. maybe to diminish the authority of the principal when it comes to teacher evaluation, by creating these kind of almost formulaic system-wide or statewide evaluation systems. Does this make it harder to recruit and retain good principals? Or is it not happening in such a way in your location that it matters?
I'm trying to wrap my arms around the question because I don't see it that way.
Okay.
Because it doesn't prescribe how you lead. The evaluation system doesn't prescribe what you actually do. It does describe what you have to assess. But for example, the instructional quality, right? How the teachers engage kids, how the teachers teach an aligned curriculum or teach the aligned curriculum. That's been there forever. That's part of any great school. And so how that happens in a building is still up to the principal. There's still autonomy around how that happens, but they do have to assess that portion. So I'm not sure there's.
But I think the burden of the question, I could be wrong, is that some of these systems that come from beyond the building are sort of formulaic. You're going to 30%. This is going to count. 20% math grades are going to count, or math scores, and that they might not fit the needs of every school, and thus sort of get in the way of a principal as the evaluator of her teachers. Is it a problem? If it's not a problem, it's not a problem, or at least if,
I think it's probably a problem in some places to some extent, but it's not an overriding issue.
okay.
Where sometimes I see it as an issue is the layer above the principal, where the principal supervisor has such a wide span of control that is they have to evaluate so many principals that the system builds in a more formulaic procedure by which they evaluate the principals on the assumption that
Too many to customize it.
there's too many to customize it. And I think you lose something in that because you don't get to know the buildings, the people, in the way that kind of judges the non-quantifiable characteristics.
So on that point, you said, I believe in Dallas, 10 or 12 principals per next level up?
Right.
What do you call them, executive?
Executive directors of a feeder pattern.
And what is your sort of unit size in Prince
I think
George's?
we're at 10 to 12 right now as well.
You are?
Yeah.
Which
yeah,
is-
span of
which is
control.
a really
which is
great
yeah,
size.
it's like the ideal
It's
spot.
about right.
What do you call those people, by the way?
Instructional directors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do they get paid more than principals, by the way?
Ours do.
Good question.
Yours do?
Yeah, they do.
They do.
So, and most of them are, in fact,
Former
all
principals?
of them are former principals.
Our former
Yeah.
principals themselves.
Excellent, high quality principals.
Of course. Of course.
So I wanted to weigh on this, weigh in on this maybe from a little different perspective.
Yeah.
In terms of, I think the complexity is around the teacher evaluation process itself for many principals. It can be very time consuming. So that's kind of the commentary I get a lot from principals in terms of not the fact that it's not a meaningful tool to help advance someone's practice, because all our evaluations need to be overhauled, and so that's not a bad thing. But it's the implementation of it. Sometimes it's messy. It's understanding, how do you, at the heart of the evaluation for us is, are you helping someone improve their practice? So the essence of that is, are you having meaningful conversations about your instructional practice? It's not the compliance element of checking all the boxes and all those things. That's important, but the true essence of what you want to have principals be effective at is having those conversations about a teacher's practice. And so I think that when, kind of to your point, Mike, is I don't want to overstate or understate, for that matter, the challenge that it may be in terms of implementing sometimes, but I don't think it's a deal breaker. Now, principals may say something different,
Okay.
but I don't think it's a deal breaker.
Others? Way in the back. And then in front of you, after you.
Hi, I'm Beth Bloffus. I'm a principal actually here in the District of Columbia. And I'd love to hear any of the panelists talk about this idea of revisioning the position. I love doing it. The one
Doing
thing
what?
that
Your current position?
yeah,
Okay.
I love being a principal. The thing that gives me pause is 60-hour weeks are great. They're fine. It's the 70 and 80-hour weeks that, kind of wear after a while. And when I think about great people I know who aren't principals, one of the key reasons is, particularly on the high school level, it's mean to your own kids to do this job and have a family. So I think that revisioning part of the proposal or part of the report is something I'd love to hear the panelists talk a little bit more about.
Okay. Go for it.
There are two big areas in the report that I came away saying we need to do a lot more about. One is to look at the recruitment data and tie that to the principal data.
Yeah.
And the second is what you just talked about. So the principals focus group that we have that meets every month, and it'll start on September 3rd, that's one of the things we're going to address, is how do we make sure that we retain our principals and reshape the job so that we do make it more attractive. I've got great principals, but many of them are doing what you said. They're working 70-hour weeks, and we know that across the board. Many of them are doing that, and that probably can't be sustained. So we have to look at it kind of like the report from the New Teacher Project on the irreplaceables for teachers. What's the same thing for irreplaceables for principals? What do we need to do differently? And so I don't have an answer for you, but I think I'm going to ask my principal focus group to come up with the answer. It's a group of about 25, 30 principals, one from each feeder pattern, and then some at-large folks. And I think they'll help.
Do you still have the mic? Get it back for a second. I'm just curious, in the DC context, do you have a team of leaders in the school, or are you sort of alone in that role?
Well, it's a good question, and part of the reason why I'm interested in this part of the report is that I'm not at a DCPS school, and I have a lot of autonomy to structure the leadership team myself, and so looking at models that do that isn't just about my 70-hour work week, it's about the effectiveness of the team in the building.
Okay.
So this issue of kind of distributive leadership or team leadership at the building level is one that a lot of big city school districts have played with over the years. It's not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination. So having somebody who takes care of budget compliance issues and paperwork, as opposed to somebody who kind of leads the instructional work with the teachers, is something that a lot of districts have actually done. Los Angeles has been a great example of that. The problem over the years has been that as districts went through various rounds of budget cuts, it was one of the very first things to cut.
These extra administrators?
Yes, indeed.
Bureaucracy, overhead.
That was exactly the way it was billed. But the result was, in cutting them, was the 70 to 80 hour work week because the principal had to pick it up.
Okay, any further comments on the revisioning? Either of you, okay. Anybody else in the room? Yes, sir, I did promise you.
Thank you. My name is Josh. I'm here from the Alliance for Excellent Education. My question is, how much should diversity factor into the talent recruitment strategy? So, for example, if a district notices that all or almost all of its principals are male, how much should that factor into the recruitment and placement and selection strategy for principals?
And what if all the males are gym teachers and none of them are Latin teachers? It's a good question.
I think in most big districts, it would simply be intolerant to have such a homogeneous group of individuals be principals. I can't imagine many big districts in diverse communities where the leadership of the community wouldn't
throw a fit.
And frankly, the community would throw a fit. Most leaders from these districts would do everything that they could to make sure that there's a diverse pool of folks. This kind of also goes into the issue we haven't talked about too much, is this match question. And maybe we can get into that.
I mean, the person and the school,
The placement.
which you were talking about working hard on to try to not just fill 12 slots with 12 random people, but with particular people in particular schools. Is that match a broad concern, Mike Casserly, across your district?
I'd say it is. People are paying much more attention to the needs of the schools, and I think the report was not quite right in saying that the districts didn't have a good sense of what the needs of the individual schools are. I think they actually do. But the skill set of the principal candidates and their ability to match them to the most compatible school, I think, is still a little bit of a guessing game. And this kind of goes up the system to the principal supervisors as well, where the principal supervisors don't necessarily get matched up with the principals that they would be best supervising. But some of this matching game is a little bit of a moving target because these schools will change demographically, the communities will change around them, the programming in the schools will change. Making sure that you have a principal that matches the needs and the offerings of the school and then keeping them for a prolonged period of time sometimes is hard to do because of all of the changes that the leadership makes to the school itself. And it's only compounded if you make them a turnaround school or they have a SIG grant or something like that, and then kind of all bets are off.
I was sort of wondering who decides what's a good match? What if the administration of the district sees one set of needs in the school, but the people who work in the school or the parents in the school see a very different set of needs or priorities? Or is this not a problem? I don't want to create artificial problems, but it occurs to me that you could get very different perspectives on what a given school needs at a point in time.
Well, if you look at places like Chicago where they have an extensive eligibility process, so they have a lot of control over who the schools can even consider.
They still have local school councils,
Right,
don't they?
so they go through the eligibility process, and then those people that have passed the district's bar are then able to be presented to the local school councils, which have representatives from the staff, from community, from parents, and so you usually get a better mix there.
In that case, the district creates the pool and the school
They
level
decide.
people pick from within
Exactly.
it.
But that gets back to the timeline challenge, because if
Yeah.
you're trying to get external talent, you needed to get the external talent through the eligibility process prior to March, when all of the openings and interviews start. So the timelines, again, have to match there, because there are only certain times in the year where Chicago does the eligibility process.
Is Chicago anomalous here in terms of sort of final choice being made at the building level rather than final choice being made at the superintendent's office?
Usually the superintendent has final sign off on the principal. Chicago is a little bit anomalous in having these local business councils exercising the kinds of influence that they do. That's unusual in most big city schools.
Mike Miles in Dallas, do you want to have the final sign off?
I have the final sign off, but we do put the finalists through a community review for input on the finalists.
So you'd have several finalists for a given slot, or?
Just one.
Oh.
And we'll say, this is the person that is slated for your school. Have an interview with the candidate and give us some input around that. And almost always they say, yeah, that person is a good fit for our school. And sometimes they say no, and usually.
And then what happens?
Usually if they say no, we'll consider, and in many cases we'll get another candidate.
You will.
Until they say that's a good fit. But there have been times already in the last couple of years, only a couple times, where I said, no, we're still going to go with this.
You've overruled the school level advice.
Yes.
Okay.
I know Jennifer Cheatham in Madison, Wisconsin has started doing this.
That's the superintendent in
Yes.
Madison, yeah.
So she's started where she's gotten the pool of people, and she has presented 3 different candidates
Yeah.
to the community, and then the school community gets to choose from the 3.
She came out of Chicago.
That's
Yeah,
the
she
Chicago.
tried that area.
That's spreading the Chicago model. Okay.
But she is choosing the 3 that
Yeah,
she
no,
wants
she
designated
creates
to
the
the
pool
school.
for that school.
But that's different than the local school councils, that usually they decide the 3 they want to look at.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Time for one last question, if there is one in the room. Yes, ma'am. You got it. Who are you?
Thank you. I'm Jackie Ball with the National Association of Secondary School Principals. You all talked a little bit about professional development. I guess my question is, how do you do that for your principals in terms of trying to keep them in and really personalize it? I know you touched on kind of how, each of the principals may need certain professional development considering the context of their school. So I think from our perspective, that's something that we continue to talk about and know that's a big concern for our members. So I'd love to hear from each of you, if we have a time, about how you're developing and continuing that process throughout their
And
career.
customizing, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Exactly.
Well, if everybody's brief, you all have the time.
Okay.
Doug.
So, for us, I think it's working in partnership. I think part of the answer to many of the challenges is collectively how we see individuals. Because my lens might be different than Allison's on a particular principle, but our data should inform how we distinguish and differentiate the support that we provide. So we look at things that like their evaluation. We look at Valid. We look at anecdotal data. We do learning walks with principals, and we try to really look at their skill set. We also make the distinction between obviously a brand new principal and a 3rd-year principal and a 5th-year principal and 15-year principal. So, trying to give them obviously some systemic work that they all need, but then understanding how well they're internalizing the PD. The most effective mechanism that we believe we have is just the job embedded experiences, and that's why mentor principals and having opportunities where people can get that arm in arm kind of coaching and support is important.
Hey, Allison.
Schools Like in Milwaukee does two different approaches. One, customized to each school. So we do a diagnostic at the beginning of the year to truly understand the needs of the school and to set the strategic plan for the support. And that will then have targeted coaching directly aligned to that school and school team's needs. But then overall, for the 37 schools and the 175 school leaders we're working with, we're doing monthly professional developments at the different roles. So for deans, instructional leaders, building leaders, and then we're also taking all of them on high-performing school visits across the city, across the region, even nationally. So it's both a customized approach to what you need in your school and for your own development, but then there are also things we do across the network.
For sort of classes of people, depending on their role in the system. Okay.
Dallas has a combination of district level and then executive director level. So at the district level, in the summer, there's 9 days of training. While we're here, principals are getting trained on the teacher evaluation. They're being actually certified. They've had 4 days of training on that. And then once a month, they have district level training for half a day. And then the rest of the year, once a month, the executive director holds a training for all the principals in the feeder pattern. And then executive directors customize the training for each principal in their group. And since they only have 10 to 12, they're able to do that.
You've got the last word, Mike Casserly.
I would associate myself with everyone else's remarks. In general, I think where principal professional development is getting better and better and more differentiated. But I have to say the overriding issue for us as we look at this is sometimes the quality of the professional development and its relevance. We often find that principal coaches provide some of the most effective professional development that are often underutilized. And three, I'm surprised at how many times the principals are not familiar with the professional development that their teachers get. And it presents attention.
On the note of tension, why don't you all join me in thanking our panelists for being here today. Thank you, audience, for being here today. And we are dismissed, and I still see fruit and cookies. So get one and something, and buttonhole a panelist with the question you didn't get to ask. Thanks, everybody.
Great listening.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you for coming so much.
Congratulations.